Good morning. Today is Tuesday, June the 2nd. I want to take a different path today. The events of this last weekend have been so disturbing that a lot of people are discouraged and even afraid. And this time it has nothing to do with a virus. Occasionally I hear someone say something like, "Things have never been this bad." And I suppose they could build a pretty good case when they think about the pandemic and the terrible division that is in the country right now and the riots that have been going on. All of these things have been taking place in our country and are disturbing indeed. And there are some who feel like things have never been worse. But I want to tell you about another year, a time when people then thought that things couldn't get any worse as well. I wrote a poem, essay, I'm not sure exactly what to call this, but I wrote this for my high school graduating class for our 50th reunion. I want to share it with you now. At the very least, I hope you'll just tolerate this. And for some of you, this is going to be kind of a reminiscence, because if you're old enough to have remembered those times, I'm going to talk about some things that you might be remembering. But let me read you this that I wrote to the graduating class of 1968 in Douglas County High School in Castle Rock, Colorado. 1968, the year, our year. Time magazine called it the year that shaped America. Life called it the year that changed the world. William Manchester wrote a history of America from 1932 to 1972 entitled The Glory and the Dream. One chapter of that book is dedicated entirely to the year 1968. He called it the year everything changed. Cliff Robertson and Frank Reynolds hosted an ABC News special just 10 years later and called it 1968, A Crack in Time. The Dow Jones average closed that year at 943. Today, it's over 26,000. The average cost of a new home was less than $15,000. The average annual income was less than $8,000. Gas was 34 cents. A new car cost $2,800. We watched The Graduate. Guess who's coming to dinner? Bonnie and Clyde, Planet of the Apes, and Rosemary's Baby. We listened to the Rolling Stones and the Supremes and the Beatles as they first sang Hey Jude. We listened to Fleetwood Mac and Aretha Franklin and Gary Puckett and the Union Gap, the Grateful Dead, the Monkees, and Simon and Garfunkel sang to us about Mrs. Robinson. The Beach Boys were still around, and so were the Bee Gees. We mellowed out to the Moody Blues, and Bobby Goldsboro made the girls cry with Honey. Probably the most trusted name in America, Walter Cronkite delivered the nightly news. Early in the year, he told us the North Koreans had captured the USS Pueblo, and we thought we were going to war. In August, he told us the Russians had invaded Czechoslovakia, and again, we thought we were going to war. All this war talk, even as that other war was killing 100 Americans a week. That year, 550,000 troops were there, and we understood that we were winning, until we weren't. All of us who were drafted or enlisted were told that we were going to Nam. A good many of us did. In January, the Tet Offensive told us the optimistic war reports were wrong, and the conversation shifted from how do we win to how do we get out. My Lai made us wonder if we were any better than those murderous commies. In April, Martin Luther King was assassinated less than 24 hours after his dream speech. In June, Robert Kennedy was also shot and killed right after the winning of the Democratic primary in California. In response to the King murder, the country was set on fire. In response to the Kennedy murder, the country began to ask, "What's happening?" And Dion sang Abraham, Martin, and John. 1968 brought a decline of certainty. It became a time of doubt. Some of us, for the first time, began to realize that our country might make mistakes. We doubted our politicians. We doubted whether we could, in fact, overcome. And we doubted the future. And then Hal, in 2001, A Space Odyssey, planted in our minds that computers might not be as trustworthy as we thought. But not all was negative. Broadway Joe Namath confidently predicted that the Jets would win Super Bowl III. They did. Nixon had been dismissed as gone from American politics. He wasn't. Most of us voted for him, and we all know how well that turned out. But, as hard as that year was, it ended on a positive upswing. On December 24th, we watched as the crew of the Pueblo was released from their North Korean captors. And that night, the whole world listened as 3 Americans orbited the moon for the first time. Their message to the world that night put everything in perspective as they read from a very old text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the way it was. That was the year. That was our year. I wrote that for my graduating class. But does any of that seem familiar to us today? That year also saw a new flu-like disease coming out of China that killed 100,000 Americans. That year was an election year. That year, we had a very controversial president in office. That year, the Democrats were divided over their candidate. That year, we saw terrible riots across the country over racial issues. And in the midst of all the bad news, we were inspired by men going into space. I say all this just to point out that we've faced difficult times before. But we came out of that stronger and better. But I must say that there is one thing missing today. That message that was given to all the people of this good earth from 3 men orbiting the moon acknowledged God. Today, God has been largely removed from much of our culture. And without God, we are floating aimlessly in this sea of trouble. Tomorrow, I want to share with you in the daily message about why the solution to the troubles of today are not going to come from men or women today. It's just not enough, whatever anybody comes up with. Nobody can solve these problems. And then the next day, I want to share with you about how that real solution can be applied. The truth is that we're facing very difficult times. But we have faced difficult times before, and there are ways through this. Today, I want you to move forward with hope and trust in our mighty God, because He has not left us.